literature. I am Fouzi Slisli, and I will be introducing this class. Today we will talk about humanism in the Renaissance, the culture that developed in the Renaissance and in a way remains with us until today. First of all, some broad and important point. The Renaissance is one of 2 or 3 moments in history, or in the history of Europe, that have been most transformative, meaning their impact has been so big and transformative. It's one of the 2 or 3 most important moments in European history. It is comparable in its magnitude to the scientific revolution and the industrial revolution. So in that sense, the transformations that the Renaissance brought about were huge and lasting, and in a way they're still with us today. Previous lectures illustrated how the Renaissance created new economic, geographical and military realities. Now we will address the new cultural realities that this period produced. So in the last 2 lectures we talked about the new economic, military and geographical realities. Today we will talk about the cultural realities that the Renaissance brought about. The culture that the Renaissance brought with it is called humanism. It is a culture that is still with us today, and many writers, intellectuals, artists and philosophers still call themselves today humanists. Originally, humanism meant that important questions of life and death, good and evil, politics, governance, etc., ceased being talked about exclusively from the perspective of the European Church. That's what originally humanism meant, that now we can address these important questions not from the perspective of the Church, but from a human perspective. These questions and many others could now be investigated and discussed by average human beings from their perspective and for their own interest. Before it was from the perspective of the Church and for the interest of the Church. Now these questions can be investigated and discussed by average human beings from their own perspective and for their own interest. That the human mind, also very important, that now the human mind can operate without the supervision of the Church, and without the Church dictating the questions and the answers. That, broadly speaking, this is the essence of the meaning of the Renaissance, that these questions can now be done by the human mind, from the human perspective, for human interest, rather without the supervision of the Church, and without the Church providing the questions and the answers. A little bit now about the evolution of humanism. Most historians say that humanism appeared first in Italy. But scholarship is showing that Renaissance, humanism and the scientific revolution of course would not be possible without the translation of Islamic books some 300 years before, in the 11th century, in Al-Andalus, in Toledo. So this is one part of the Renaissance that remains badly investigated today. Most historians trace the Renaissance to Italy, and I think they forget to give credit to the translation of books, Islamic books, from Al-Andalus in the 11th century. In this lecture we will focus on Italy only here. The reason why humanism emerged in Italy are many. First of all, Italy is the home of the Roman Empire, and it's the home of its Latin culture. And much of humanism consisted in reviving the Latin literature and poetry of classical Rome. So what we call the culture of humanism in its essence, is an attempt to revive the culture and the poetry of ancient Rome, of classical Rome. Humanism emerged in Italy also because a substantial amount of Latin literature of classical Rome was still available in the churches, monasteries, and private villas of Italy. The church did not allow these texts to circulate before, but the weakness of the church now, the invention of printing, and the increased wealth made these texts and books available to the public to read, to translate, to imitate, to discuss, and so on. The emerging states in Europe have a need for administrators and secretaries and writers too. So now there is new states in Europe, and these states now have a need for administrators, secretaries, writers, educated people to manage the new wealth they have now from the new trade routes that they have established. So there is a need for educated people, there is a need for new education. The humanists were these writers, secretaries, and administrators. They were essentially educated people at the services of kings and princes and wealthy and rich individuals. They provided those kings, meaning the humanist intellectuals, they provided these kings and princes with what the church could not provide: a secular education, a secular outlook on life, secular capabilities to do transactions, business, letter writing, bookkeeping, all these requirements, these new requirements that the new market, the new trade routes now demanded, and which the church education and the church culture could not provide. And therefore there is a need for a new type of educated people. And it's these new educated people that are the humanists, and the culture they brought with them to the courts of these kings and rich people is the culture of humanism. And it was the pursuit of that secular education that made humanists also, it made them travel across Europe looking for classical texts from ancient Rome and Greece. Because their education, essentially, there was no secular education in Europe. The only thing that was secular were the texts and the books from ancient Rome and Greece. So there was a lot of demand for these ancient texts, and humanists traveled from Holland to Italy to England to France looking for new manuscripts. Whenever they hear that there is a new manuscript that's been discovered in some part of France or England or Holland or Italy, you see humanists traveling across Europe to go looking for these texts and to read them and discuss them, and hopefully even bring copies back with them. And it was the spirit, it was the pursuit of that secular education that made humanists travel across Europe looking for classical texts from ancient Rome and Greece. This informal movement, it's an informal movement of scholars spread from Italy to Holland to Germany to France and England, and was responsible for the great literature and science that became a feature of this era and which influenced Europe and the world. Some of the most important humanists, or the most important writers and thinkers that spread humanism, were people like Francesco Petrarca, known simply as Petrarch. He was born in 1304 and died in 1374. Born in 1304 and died in 1374. So he is a 14th century writer. He's known as the father of humanism. He's a Florentine, meaning he's from Florence. And he spent his youth in Tuscany and lived in Milan and Venice. He was a collector of old manuscripts, and through his efforts, the speeches of Cicero and the poems of Homer and Virgil, all of them from classical Greece and Rome, through his efforts, the speeches of Cicero and the poems of Homer and Virgil became known to Western Europe again. Petrarch's work also led to the rise of people known as civic humanists, or those individuals who were civic-minded and looked to the government of the ancient world for inspiration. These were people who were intellectuals, writers, poets, and so on, but who felt they had a civic mission to help establish a good government and a good administration, and to participate in this government and this administration. Petrarch also wrote sonnets, poems that are called sonnets in Italian. Many of these sonnets expressed his love for a woman called Laura that he never manages to it's a love that never gets fulfilled. So there's always this, unfulfilled love for a certain lady called Laura. His sonnets greatly influenced other writers of the time across Europe, to the point that there was a movement called Petrarchism in poetry, and we will talk about that in the next lectures. Other important writers and thinkers include Giovanni Pico, di la Mirandola. He was born in 1463 and died in 1494, a 15th century writer. He was an Italian who lived in Florence and who expressed in his writings the belief that there was no limit to what man could accomplish. As you can notice, these are new ideas. This was not possible to say or think or express aloud before the Renaissance. But now you see that writers across Europe are saying things like this. I should also mention Leonardo Bruni, born in 1369 and died in 1444. He wrote a biography of Cicero, the famous Roman rhetorician and politician. Bruni also encouraged people to become active in the political as well as the cultural life of their cities. He was a historian who today is most famous for a book called The History of the Florentine Peoples. The History of the Florentine Peoples. It's a 12-volume work. It's a huge 12-volume work. He was also the Chancellor of Florence from 1427 until his death in 1444. We should also mention Boccaccio, Giovanni Boccaccio, famous for his long poem, the Decameron. He was born in 1313 and died in 1375. So again, he's 14th century. Notice that most of the 14th century has been very much an Italian affair. Most of the great writers of the 14th century were Italian, and most of their work will go to influence the rest of Europe in the 15th and 16th century. So Boccaccio wrote the Decameron. There are hundreds of short stories related by a group of young men and women who fled to a villa outside Florence to escape the Black Death. Boccaccio's work is considered to be the best prose of the Renaissance. Also important to mention is Baldassare Castiglione. Baldassare Castiglione, born in 1478 and died in 1529. He wrote one of the most widely read books, The Courtier, which set forth the criteria on how to be the real Renaissance man. He basically set a bunch of criteria and rules and principles and said, if you want to be a real Renaissance man, this is what you need to do. Castiglione's ideal courtier was a well-educated, mannered aristocrat who was a master in many fields, from poetry to music to sports, This is the ideal of the well-rounded individual who was educated in as many fields as possible and could discourse and have conversations about as many topics as possible. Also showed good manners and ability to travel and discover and so on. So if we contrast this new humanist culture with the culture that existed in medieval Europe, we will see a huge transformation taking place in Europe. In the medieval period, the church restricted the intellectual life to priests and monks. Only priests and monks could be educated, had access to books, not all books, but a restricted number of books, and even these men, meaning the priests and monks, were not free to think, to analyze and read. Not even the Bible was available to them to read freely and to discuss freely. So intellectual life in the Middle Ages had been formalized and conventionalized. So formalized meaning that the church asked the questions and provided the answers, and the priests and the monks only had to repeat these instructions. They couldn't think for themselves. So intellectual life had been formalized and conventionalized by the church and by church limitations until this intellectual life had become largely barren and unprofitable. There was nothing to learn in it. The whole sphere of knowledge, all the questions that had to do with knowledge, had been subjected to the mere authority of the church and the church's narrow interpretation of the Bible. So whatever topic it is, whether it's life, whether it's death, whether it's war, whether it's peace, whether it's the human mind, whether it's science, whether it's family life, everything was basically had been subjected to the authority of the church and the church's narrow interpretation of the Bible. No one was allowed to think or discuss outside these limitations. Also, in the medieval period, scientific investigation was almost entirely stifled, and progress was impossible. There was almost nothing left to do. It was impossible to progress. The fields of religion and knowledge had become stagnant under pretty much an arbitrary despotism. So the people who were at the top of the church dictated what could be thought and what couldn't be thought, what could be discussed and what couldn't be discussed, and everybody just had to accept it. This is the situation in the medieval period. The advent of humanism changes this radically. First of all, humanism gives us historical thought. How did it do that? Well, first it ended the church's dominance of education and the pursuit of knowledge. The church is not responsible for education exclusively anymore. I mean, there are still people who are educated in the church, but if you don't want to be educated in the church, there is other places that, you know, that are outside the church authority where people can acquire an education now in a humanistic tradition. Written history started being written from a secular perspective instead of from the supernatural perspective of church dogma. In the medieval period, written history was written from the perspective of the dogma of the church. Everything had to be explained in supernatural form, dictated by the church. With the Renaissance and the impact of humanism, written history can be written now from a secular perspective, from a human perspective, as opposed to a supernatural perspective. And it is from this transformation that we get the division of history into ancient, medieval, and modern. This is a tripartite division, ancient, medieval, and modern, that's still with us today. We still use this distinction today to read history. So whoever is studying history today, whoever talks about history today, accepts this division into ancient, medieval, and modern. In relation to the classical tradition, classical texts and classical books, the impact of the Renaissance changed the situation too. Thinkers or writers like Virgil, Cicero, Aristotle, Plato, they're no longer regarded as mysterious prophets from a dimly imagined past. In the medieval period, they were seen as some kind of like mysterious prophets from some era that's far away in the past. We don't know how far away it was. Now, with the Renaissance and humanism, Virgil, Cicero, Aristotle, Plato, and others are now seen as real men of flesh and blood, speaking out of experiences that were remote in the past, but they were no less humanly real. They were real human experiences, so which means we could read them, we could compare them to our own, people could compare them to their own experience in the Renaissance and could learn valuable lessons from them about how to conduct education, about how to think, and so on and so forth. During the Middle Ages in Western Europe, Latin was the language of the church and the educated people. There were no local languages. The European languages were not written, they didn't have rules, they were not languages of instruction or knowledge. Humanists and humanism began to use the vernacular. These are the European languages. And the humanists helped to develop the national languages of their countries. This is the time, this is the era when European languages like Italian, French, English, and German start developing. Also, humanists had a great impact on education. They supported study in grammar, poetry, and history, as well as mathematics, astronomy, and music. They promoted the concept of the well-rounded individual, or the Renaissance man, who was proficient in both intellectual and physical endeavors. Humanism also revived the Roman idea that an educated man should have civic duties, which means that an educated person should also participate in the politics and the management of his own society and in the improvement of the government and the society. This is civic duties. So being educated became a question of being educated in ideas, but also being involved in society and in government. The word human became a catchword on everybody's lips, as opposed to the word supernatural, as opposed to the supernatural explanations of the medieval church. Now, all the explanations are from a human perspective, by humans, for human interests. History, everything basically. History, politics, science, commerce, religion, life, everything started being explained from a human perspective for human interests, hence the word humanism. Humanism understood that these questions had been addressed and investigated by the classics, by the Greeks and by the Romans. And an unprecedented effort began in Europe for the recuperation of those ancient cultures and their texts, so that, Europeans could study them and learn from their experience and transform their present through it. The discovery of the ancient texts of Greek and Rome, was accompanied also by a new creative enthusiasm in literature and all the arts. It culminated particularly in the early 16th century in the appearance of some of the greatest painters in Western history, people like Leonardo da Vinci, Raphael, and Michelangelo. But also, in a way, to use a metaphor, the light of the darkness also had its darkness. Breaking away from the medieval frameworks of mind also often meant that Europeans were relapsing into crude paganism, right? And the enjoyment of pleasures with no restraints. Hence, the Italian Renaissance is also often called pagan. It's a pagan Renaissance. Pagan is, and many in England and France protested against the idea, protested against this new paganism and the habits that their youths were bringing back with them from their studies in Italy. From Italy, the Renaissance spreads northward, first into France, and as early as the middle of the 15th century, English students were frequenting the Italian universities, and soon they will be bringing their education back to their home country. Soon the study of Greek was introduced into England, first at Oxford. It was so successful there in Oxford that when in the early 16th century the great Dutch student and reformer Erasmus was too poor to go to Italy, so he went to Oxford instead and studied Greek there. The invention of printing is a very, very, very important event in the Renaissance. It transforms the concept of the book and creates book markets and facilitates the distribution of ideas in an unprecedented manner. Before, there had been, in the medieval period, the people wrote manuscripts, and the only books that were available were handwritten, laboriously handwritten, which takes time and effort, and then you can't make many copies anyway. They were, with the Renaissance and the invention of printing, it became easier to publish books, not only cheaply, but in great quantities. It's easy to produce hundreds of copies and distribute them, which means that it becomes easier to open universities. Once you have books are easy to produce, then you can have, the only thing you need is a space and teachers. So it's easy to open universities, and this is the time when many of the European universities are opening their doors, and it's easy to start scholarly and educational circles everywhere. In England, which is, our interest because we are looking at English literature, the Renaissance had a profound impact, especially in the court, in the royal court, where literature had a center stage. Because the old nobility had perished in the wars, the old noblemen, the old noble people in England had perished in the wars, Henry VII, the founder of the Tudor line, and his son, Henry VIII, adopted the policy of replacing this old nobility with able and wealthy men of the middle class. The court, the royal court, therefore, became a brilliant and crowded circle of unscrupulous but usually adroit statesmen, and a center for lavish entertainments and cultural and intellectual and poetic and literary entertainment and displays. Under this new aristocracy, the rigidity of the feudal system, the old feudal system, it was becoming rigid, so it was relaxed. And life became somewhat easier for all the dependent classes. Modern comforts, too, were introduced, and with them the Italian art and literature. This is the end of this overview of the culture of humanism, the culture of the European Renaissance, its evolution and its impact, and I hope to see you soon next when we talk about English literature. Thank you for following, and Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.